Welcome to the Exponential Australia Church Leaders Podcast.
Well, hello and welcome to the Exponential Australia Church Leaders Podcast. We're just so glad that you would join us today, as we've been hearing from all range of voices from both around the world as well as here in Australia, particularly with regards to church planting and renewal and the great hopes that we have to see many more churches planted here in Australia. And today we are joined by a Canadian voice, by Jason Ballard, who is the leader of the Way Church in Vancouver. He is also very involved in helping to lead the Canadian Church Leaders Network. And many of you may recognize him as well from his involvement with Alpha and the great work that Alpha is doing all around the world and as well here in Australia. Jason, we're just so glad that you would join us today.
Buddy, it is good to be with you. I mean, people aren't going to know this, but like you and I work together at Alpha and we're so far apart on the other part of the world. So an excuse to be able to chat with you. And I'm just picturing like a huddle of the pastors that are listening in from around Australia, and it feels pretty special to have this time together.
Absolutely, Jason. I think that's a great image. Well, hey, why don't we jump straight in today, particularly for those who may not be, I guess, aware of some of your ministry and what you're doing at the moment. We're going to get to some of the story of the Way a little bit later today, but I wonder if you would just share what is going on in your world, because you juggle a couple of different things and you're very humble about it all. But would you give us just a bit of a sketch of what does life look like for you at present?
Sure. Well, 2 years ago, we moved to Vancouver. So I was in the suburbs of Vancouver in a city called Langley. I moved to Langley because I met a girl at a Christian youth conference, and I found out her dad was the lead pastor of a massive church, massive Pentecostal church. I didn't grow up near Pentecostalism, and it was a massive Pentecostal church. So I met her though at this conference, and I was like, well, I need to move to Langley and get a job at that church to date the pastor's daughter. So up until about 2.5 years ago, we're living in Langley and part of that church. And then we moved to Vancouver to plant a church here with some friends. Amazing. And so I've got 3 kiddos, Hudson, Mary, and Millie. As we're recording this, Hudson turned 9 last week. Millie's birthday was yesterday. The thing I'm doing right after this is going on an ice cream date with Millie. And she's 5, but her concept of time is just still not good. And so she knew it was today, but like so many times throughout the day, she's called me being like, are we going now? And I'm like, babe, it's after dinner, but it's just not registering. So that's the plan for the day. So I'm a parent, I'm married, and I'm leading a church here in Vancouver that we started in September 2020. And we have this organization called Canadian Church Leaders Network, which is really just trying to champion pastors across Canada. And we can chat more about some of the ways we do that. And then one of the things that kind of came about organically is like, I did work with Alpha and really any tool that could serve local churches in creative ways I've been really drawn to. So I was really drawn to Alpha, like how can we build a resource, that high school students use, could share their faith with their friends. And so working with a few different projects like that to try to think how can we build a resource that serve local churches. That's kind of where I put my time and my energy right now.
Yeah. You would never go about saying this, Jason, but I've always admired just your particular giftedness and passion for the whole church, and particularly what the Lord is doing both around the world, but increasingly obviously for you in this season, what the Lord is doing in Canada. But given some of your experiences working with Alpha, connecting with a variety of church leaders in different environments, you seem to have a great degree of wisdom and appreciation of what the Lord is doing around the world, and particularly amongst the next generation. I think that's quite profound. And I wonder if you could, even to begin our time, and of course we don't want to make this, particularly as we're constantly referring to the pandemic and what's happened over the last couple of years, but what are some of the things that you're beginning to observe, particularly in Canada, I guess, but amongst the next generation of leaders? What are they hungering for? What are they sensing? What are the opportunities that we are stepping into in this time?
I think it's such an important question. One of the main things I've been thinking throughout the pandemic, and there's something new happened. I think it's social media that's affected it. Obviously, social media has affected so many things, but the news cycle, the accessibility of it, people say things like, oh, 2022, it's like the worst year ever. It's like, or 2021, like what's next? And it does feel like as soon as one sort of global thing happens, then there's the next and the next and next. But the truth is, we all know this, it's always been very difficult on planet Earth. Very difficult to, it's just difficult. It's hard on planet Earth, and building disciples, it's what God's doing, but it's always been challenging. And I think, when I think about, the question of like what's happening and what's going on, I think what I'm being drawn to is to kind of go, how do I zoom out a little bit and be like, the church has made it through world wars before, pandemics before. Like, I'm really drawn to like just reading this new book, or not new book, new to me, but book by Jerry Sitzer. He's talking a ton about the first, second, third century. It's just like crazy. How did the church survive against like the force of Rome and the pushback of the religious movements? Like, it made no sense. Like, but it was all subversive. It was like discipleship making. It was loving the poor, and then the poor would become Christians, and then it would change their lives and change their future. And it's just like, I'm really drawn. I think one of the things that God is doing is like reminding us that it's like, hey, there's some basic building blocks to how I've been transforming lives through the Spirit and making disciples that are pretty enduring. Like, I love, like, Charlie, you and I would chat forever and about like new innovation and stuff like that. But I don't think the church really needs innovation. I think we need to be thoughtful. I think we need to use new tools that are available to us. I think we need to be creative in our missional response to the culture around us. But I think one of the big things that I'm encouraged about is I think we're asking questions like, how do we make one disciple?
Yeah.
Like, I'm haunted by that question. In the city of Vancouver, how do you help one person who maybe didn't grow up around any semblance of Christianity, not only become a follower of Jesus, but for the way of Jesus to make its way into every little crevice of his or her life? And I've been thinking about that, like, how do you make one disciple? And then it raises this other question for me is like, am I a disciple? Like, am I actually like signed up for the discipleship journey? So I think one of the things that God is doing is, and I'm not trying to be like overly Socratic or like deconstruct everything down to it, like, but just, I think that's like this really essential moment where we go, oh, I think there's a lot of things that were good activity that bore some measure of fruit, but cause us to look away from maybe the deeper question of, are we forming resilient disciples? Are we bringing real transformation on a societal level? And so I think one of the opportunities of this season is some of the things that are maybe distracting us or gave the illusion of a measure of success have sort of lost their sustaining effectiveness. And it's inviting us back to some of those deeper questions. And you can ask like a Carey Nieuwhof or a Mark Sayers, like, what's happening beneath those things. Like, there's, as I understand, like, obviously there's like an exodus of baby boomers, and it's changed the way wealth is distributed, the way people volunteer and participate, people's expectations, even around religious affiliation, talking specifically in like a Western context like my own. And what all that I think adds up to, though, is a sense of like, oh, some of the things that really seem to work aren't working the same way. But the things that have always worked, like opening scripture, inviting people into it, praying for people, like, it's not like there's no big new thing we need. You know what I mean? Like, people are like, let's get on the metaverse. I'm like, we should do that.
Yeah.
But it's like, that's not our core problem. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Although if someone's doing church on the metaverse, I'd love to hear about it. I think it's awesome. I love that. I just think it's like, even on the metaverse, we still need to figure out how to make one disciple. And so that's the question I'm thinking a lot about.
It's great, Jason. I love that. Yeah. So much of what we're aching for the Lord to do in our midst and into the future is really the ancient paths, right? It's so much of a returning to what, God's church has always been about. And I guess that brings me to a question for you today, particularly around the way Vancouver. And you were one of those crazy people, within a team to go about planting a church within the pandemic. And I guess one of the things that I've just witnessed from afar, I'm yet to visit the way and would love to do that in the future. But you seem to have gone about pioneering a church in a really team approach to ministry. Like, it seems very intentional as an outsider that this is not about any one personality or the church planter. It's actually about much more than that. There is a hunger for God to do something amongst a group of people that's going to revitalize churches, do something new that's going to catalyze mission in the city of Vancouver. And I guess even dialing in on, some of your relationship with someone like Daryl, who has been like a spiritual grandfather in Vancouver, has been so significant by way of what the Lord is doing at the way. I wonder if you just share some of that story over the last couple of years. I'm sure that hasn't been accidental. I'm sure that's been deeply intentional and you've thought very profoundly about.
Well, we didn't plan to plant in the pandemic. We just thought September 2020 sounded like a great date in 2018 when we were like making plans, and sometimes you like raise money and people are like, well, when does this thing start? You're like, well, September 2020, And then I remember March rolled around. That was when the restrictions sort of all like came falling down here. We're running an alpha. And it was a really exciting time because a bunch of us had moved to the city and we had a couple small groups in houses, and we shut down the small groups and did one alpha together because we wanted to bake into our DNA a heart for those far from God. And there's still different discipleship expressions and community expressions. So it wasn't like we were closing up, but we hadn't launched the church yet. And we wanted to get alphas happening beforehand. And we do one in person, and most of our team had never done alpha, and they're so bravely inviting friends and people are showing up. I'm like, I didn't think this would work. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, in Vancouver, this is working. People are coming, asking great questions. And then the pandemic restrictions hit and it all got shut down. And it was so discouraging. And we did plant with a team, and I'd love to kind of parse what that means out with you a little bit and have a bit of a conversation. What does it mean to have complementary gifts, and what does team look like, and what does it cost to work as a team? But I don't think I would have made it if I didn't have people in it with me. Like, I just don't know how people do, like, keep going when everything became so complicated and tricky. But there was a moment of discouragement, but it passed pretty quickly when we realized, like, there was a sense like, oh, maybe this is why, like, this is what the Lord is doing. Yeah. Because we were surprised, but he wasn't. And I think we felt an increased galvanized courage that we were meant to plant a church in Vancouver in 2020. And so it gave us a lot of courage, actually. And one of the things that we were really fortunate is some of my best friends lead churches, and they had to like shift their existing staff, program structures, communications to accommodate new restrictions. We had the benefit as a church plant of building for the pandemic and not having, so like, for example, my friends' churches, most people listening, people said things like small groups online are not as good as they were in person. Well, we never had an in-person small group except for those two little ones that we had earlier on. But most people that joined, so we launched in September, and in September of 2020, and we started a few small groups online. 90% of those people had never been to something in person. So they didn't complain too much. They complained about other things, but not about that. So that's where it started. And the team approach is interesting. Like, there's some sort of like more obvious principle of just like complementary skills and gifts. Like, I'm so aware of how much deficiency I have as a leader. I'm aware of my strengths. Like, I'm not just trying to be, I'm aware of some of my strengths, but I'm so aware also of my weaknesses. Yeah. And it's just so obvious to me. And I think it just seems plain in scripture of like God thoughtfully distributing gifts for the purpose of interdependence. Yeah. And it seems as if God's glorified in like the experiment of interdependence. Like, I'm not going to let one person run the show. Yeah. It's not ideal. I do believe in leadership. We have a very clear leadership structure. It's not like, we're not flipping a coin who's deciding what. It's very clear. We need courageous leadership. We need decisive leadership. Friedman talks about the failure of nerve. We need like a courageous, decisive leader in moments like this. But team speaks this idea of complementary gifts, but it's something that God did. Like, he really knit a few of us together and called us to plant together in the city of Vancouver. So I think about my friend Chris and Jeremy. The three of us began this discernment journey together. Like, Chris was leading a church. Jared could plant a church on his own. He's so gifted and good. But God called the three of us together, and it was really covenantal. And I mean that, like, we felt and discerned together with our spouses, and over about 2 years, are we doing this together? Yeah. And that became the foundation of the covenantal relationship. And I don't necessarily encourage anyone else to do that. That's just our story. Like, we found ourselves, that God had led us together, and that commitment has been so important through all this. And there's been moments where it's been really difficult, really difficult to do team. One of the things that, I don't know if I've ever said this in a public setting, I didn't want to call our church The Way. Wow. Everyone's like really precious about their names, but like Chris and Jared love that name. And I'm like, I don't know. Like, like, I like the values, I get it, like the way of Jesus. I think it's like, I got it, it's cool. And like, we're in a city, like people need to find a path, he's the path, he's the way, like this all works. But I was like, that's kind of maybe cheesy. But it was one of those first moments where I was like, oh, because I function in that senior leadership position, like lead among peers on a staff level. I'm like, oh, this is a micro moment that I'm going to do 1,000 times of going, I think this is what they really want. And I don't think it's a destructive decision. So let's do it.
Wow.
And I just don't think we talk enough about what it feels like to really do church as a team or lead as a team. I think we talk a lot about, so I think a lot about that. But then there's another experiment. It was around teaching and preaching. Is like, I love to preach. But I was like, oh, what if we had a team teaching approach? And again, there's so many different ways to do church. But I was like, if we could mobilize many communicators, then we could find ourselves in a position where the lead pastor isn't spending half their week writing next week's sermon. Yeah. And then we could put energy and gifts towards other things. But then also we have a real vision. This is where, comes out of what we feel called to raise up people and to send out planters and pastors. So then we needed an environment where it can't just be a steady diet of one communicator, and then the guy that's just learning, the girl who's just learning has to go out. Like that's too intense. So we just made a bunch of decisions around team, and we're still learning what that means. But all I can say in our case is that I wouldn't change that at all. And I don't think we would have made it if it wasn't like that. And I'm just so aware of, like, for example, I just really struggle with, like, I'm just not the tender pastor that people need to walk with. Yeah. And I'm also not, like, I read Eugene Peterson's recent biography, or like the one that authorized biography. And my mentor, Daryl, I was talking about, I'm like, oh, I just feel like I felt like so inadequate. Like I just don't walk with the Lord like he does, and sit and read in silence. And Daryl was just so kind to me. He's like, he affirmed what I saw in Eugene and affirmed those longings, those stuff that's reproducible. And I think there's lots to learn there. But he's like, but you're not wired like Eugene. Yeah. He's a monk. Yeah. That's what Daryl said. Daryl's like 72 and a lot like Eugene. He's like, Jay, like, you've got to, like, solve problems and build teams. Wow. And it was just like, it was just so healing for me, for him just to identify that you can be a pastor and use different gifts. And so that's kind of what we're doing, is trying to lead a church together with a clear structure. And I can talk more about the structure if there's any interest in that, but it's about complementary gifts and empowering people for real.
That's great. Jason, I'm really curious about the dynamics of that mentoring relationship with Daryl. I just go, how significant that is in the life of a city for a leader, a spiritual grandfather, to go, actually, I'm going to do all I can to cheer on the next generation, what the Lord is doing. And so I wonder if you could just reflect a little bit on that relationship and the significance of that, and what that means for you as a comparative younger leader, to actually go, yeah, I've got the previous generation in my corner, and we can do this together.
Yeah. So for context, Daryl Johnson, he's in his 70s, early 70s, amazing guy, incredible Bible teacher. I'm definitely biased. I think he's like the best expository preacher on planet Earth. Wow. He's like a more charismatic, like spirit-filled Tim Keller, or like less sort of prickly John Piper. You know what I mean? Like, he's just like tender and, thoughtful and just deeply committed to expository preaching. And I heard him preach a couple times, and I was just like, that's the best thing I've ever heard. And so when I found out that he had moved from, first he was in California in the Presbyterian Church, then pastored in Manila, back in California, and then to Vancouver for Regent College. Shortly after Eugene Peterson left Regent College, they're building maybe the pastoral program, the preaching program, brought up Daryl, and he was professor there. And then he was recruited to First Baptist, which is this really important church in the heart of Vancouver. And he's passed there for a number of years. And he really was like a father in the city. And so one of the things we did as we were church planting is we met with as many pastors and ministry leaders as possible. I don't think I'm exaggerating at all. It helps that there's 3 of us. We must have met with at least 50. And the posture was like, we're not trying to come to plant a church. We want to play our part in the renewal of the city. Yeah. And so we just think relationship is the fabric of potential trust. And so we'll just open these doors. wasn't about asking permission. It was about sincerely just building a relationship. The reason why I say not permission as a side note is like, you have to be really sincere. Like, what if they said no? Would you not go? So we didn't pretend like we're asking for permission. I think we're coming. We really wanted to learn and build relationships. And so I met with Daryl and met him in different occasions, and God like knit our hearts together. And he had expressed that he wanted to give his life away, like relationally to the next generation, but also he has this incredible body of work, like someone who's manuscripted sermons for 50 years of preaching, who's written these expository books. He's like, I want to give it all away, like literally gift it. So we began to kind of dream up what that looked like. And so, we had this team with CCLM that was building, web things and videos and all this. So we said, well, hey, would you be okay if we gave away all of your stuff for free? And so we started working on that but then he and I's hearts just knit together more and more and more and more. And one day we're having lunch together at a place called Boston Pizza, which is a chain in Canada. And I said, hey, Daryl, would you plant this church with us? And like, he starts like just welling up right away. Like the Spirit just had done something in his heart. And he said he would. And honestly, if somebody walked up to me and was like, here's $1 million for your church plant, that would have done less to build my confidence in what I'm doing than Daryl saying yes. Because what I saw in Daryl was a life, not a ministry model, not even an approach to preaching, a life that I wanted. Curious about God, in love with his wife, full of joy about what he learned that morning in the Word, like generous in his approach to others, like just this like vibrant picture of a disciple of Jesus, someone who's walked with the Lord, and not like burdened by years of all the things that didn't work, but full of hope about what could happen. Not always meeting to talk about like critiquing my technique in ministry, but always going after my heart, And so what that looks like today is we set every Thursday, 3 to 5 on our calendar. It says like walk with Daryl. We probably only get 2 out of 4 of those done, whether he's traveling or I am or life, but we put, it's there every single week. And then, at the beginning of every month, we go, how many of these can we hit? And then he's on our staff. So he comes to our staff meeting. He's on our preaching team. He's like all of the millennials and Gen Zs in our church's favorite preacher. And, it's really funny because, we all just preach his sermons anyways. And so it's like, he should just be up there every week, but we're just preaching his old manuscripts. So That's half true. That's not entirely true. So, and what's been just stunning about it is it gives me courage and hope. Like I confide in him the things that I'm afraid of.
Yeah.
Like there's things I'm really dealing with fear about being a pastor in Vancouver. And I bet most people listening to this, you wonder like, am I going to be mistaken as a hateful bigot for just trying to teach the word of God? Are my kids going to be okay? Are they going to get won over by the culture around me? And I'll walk with Daryl and I'll tell him about these things, or I'm being criticized for, like we all are, like, because of everything we do now is on social media. So people just like, we're on, because the church online, like posting, say, Daryl, like I'm really struggling. And again, I don't think I could do it without that. Like he's just been that friend for me that I needed, and a mentor, and a life that I want to follow. And what's really changed for me, Charlie, probably even since the last time we talked, like I used to think a lot about like what I'm trying to do with my life. And I don't know if this is just because of how many pastors haven't made it. I feel deep down in my heart that one of the main things I'm trying to do is still love Jesus, the Bible, the church, and my family, and them love me 50 years from now.
Wow.
I'm trying to actually orchestrate my life like that's the end goal.
Yeah.
And that's probably not very inspiring. It's probably more inspiring to be like, we want to multiply sites across the city of Vancouver. We think about that, or we want to, but I just feel like that's, and that's what I see in Daryl. It's just a life like that. And it's so fun. And another thing that's really interesting is, again, everyone romanticizes working together, but like Daryl and I both talked to, like being on the same team and him having to like sync up with a team teaching model when he didn't do that, and there's liturgical things he would have done differently. And we have these conversations. And what's interesting about team across generation is like, we actually do speak a different language, and you have inherent different values. So what authenticity, that which, like for a millennial listener, like authenticity, we all know what we mean. That's a very different expression for someone who's a boomer. And so the patience required for Daryl and I to consistently give each other the benefit of the doubt so we can work together. It's one thing to be mentored and just have these but to really work together, that's been a very fascinating journey. I realize it demands a more slowed down version of myself. It demands a more empathetic way of listening. And it kind of demands that I would actually ask the question, how is what I'm communicating being experienced for him or for anyone from a different generation for that matter? And I'm very fortunate in this case that he's so extremely gracious and generous, but it's helped me actually in other intergenerational relationships a ton.
Wow. I think
Can I share one more thing?
Of course, go for it.
So he does this interesting thing. We hang out, if we go for a walk, and we always have so much we want to talk about, something happened in the church or an update, or we like talking about the Bible. So a theological thing, we always get going. So 10 minutes into the walk, we're talking 10 different things, something that happened in the news or a new book or whatever. And then he always goes, before we go any further, let's just open a passage of scripture together.
Right.
And I always think he's got the end goal being he's going to teach me how to read that text or something. But usually we open Psalm 119, and Psalm 118 has each one for the letter of the alphabet. So it's super long. So we'll read one stanza, and he'll just go, what do you think? And I'll share some things what about you? What do you think? And he'll share some things. And then the conversation completely changes, because all of a sudden now we're living in the realm of God's story. And it's so basic what he's doing is being before we go any further, can we just open up the Bible together? And I just feel discipleship's not that confusing, but I'm why didn't I have this idea? Where did he get this idea? It's just he's so disciplined each time to be and he takes notes, and I said, what are you taking notes about? He's so I can pray for you. And then he does it.
Wow.
And it's those two things of opening up the Bible with me and then actually praying for me has been one of the most profound things. And then seeing his life, the way he just navigates life as someone who's been a disciple of Jesus for all those years. So I'm very grateful. If you've never heard of Daryl Johnson, you should buy all of his books.
Wow.
Especially Discipleship on the Edge, which is his reflections on the book of Revelation as a discipleship manual for followers of Jesus in very secular contexts, and his book Experiencing the Trinity, and every one of his sermons is free online.
Yeah.
And so you can just search almost any text and it's there. And he's the best. He's the best.
I think that's quite a holy moment, Jason, just to kind of share of that relationship and the significance of that. And I guess that would definitely be our hope and prayer for all sorts of leaders across Australia that might be able to have, obviously unique to their own context, but those level of relationships and recognizing the great need for the whole family of God together, that the generations that have been before, those that are yet to come. And just, the effect of someone who's prepared to go, I want to do all that I can to see the next generation flourish, and this church particularly be birthed in a city like Vancouver. And that really ties, I guess, into my next question relating to, as you guys were able to connect with a whole range of church leaders in Vancouver and really come with that vision, that mentality of we want the city of Vancouver to be the church. We want the kingdom to come in Vancouver in all sorts of different churches. You and I were just speaking offline before we hit record about some of your approach to revitalization. And you guys had initially started one location, and you've since also connected with another location in the north of Vancouver, and been able to bring some of what you guys have brought to the city in that relationship. I wonder if you'd talk about both that unique challenge of doing something new, but also engaging with the old, that has been there for some time, and what that means to kind of coalesce those things.
So here's the context for Vancouver, and it's probably true in a lot of cities in Australia. It's true in a lot of cities across Canada, not everyone, but especially the more urban centers. But I think it's true across the board. Churches are increasingly almost empty, so it's there's these incredible church buildings in the case of Vancouver, massive real estate, super expensive, and yet there's not a lot of people in them. But at some point in their story, there's vibrancy. Almost every one of these churches had these moments, and there's been really faithful people giving and serving. But this is part of the decline of many of these churches. And then every once in a while, there's other churches in the city that are like church plants meeting in a gym and they're growing, but there's fewer and fewer of those as well. Yeah. But there's this kind of question of like, what about these churches? They're struggling. And it's not just a change in culture where there's not as much engagement from culture. There's also this leadership crisis. And it's just, there's not enough pastors to fill the pulpits or to fill the leadership spots. Like there's just an absence of leaders to fill the spots, not just the senior leader, although that's a big part of it. Elders and teams and volunteers and youth pastors, all that stuff. So there's this crisis. So we kept asking the question, like, what does it mean for us to come to Vancouver, not to plant just a church, but to see renewal in the city? And so we just had this conviction we need to see many, many churches. And so, by the way, as a side note, I pray all the time that God, literally I pray this is no exaggeration, God send Australian church planters to Vancouver. Wow. I just think, because there's some great planters that have come to Vancouver from Australia, and I'm like, they just have this like confidence and courage that's like, they have the good sarcasm to relate to Canadians, but this like vibrancy and confidence that like we're just like, we'll never make it. And they're like, we're gonna get after it. So I'm always like, send more Australian church planters to Vancouver. So we want to see lots of churches grow and thrive, and so we literally just started helping as many churches as we could, because there's all these churches, and so we would like have these meetings, and they say things like, we don't have a preacher right now, and we just have this big team, and we're also developing people. So we send out speakers all the time to different churches in the city to help, and but I'll help with web stuff and video stuff, and like, because we got this young team, right? Like that's just where we're at. And one of those relationships, there was a church in North Vancouver, which is a city just north of Vancouver, about a 20-minute drive, 15-minute drive from the downtown core of Vancouver, and we were helping them. They lost their pastor at the beginning of the pandemic. It's a 50-year-old church, almost 50 years old. Maybe they had, I don't know, like somewhere between 30 and 50 people sort of left at the time. Maybe a bit more. It's just hard to know in the pandemic and all that. But they were a church with a rich history and people with a lot of vision to see that change but not know what to. And then after a number of pastor turnovers, pastor left at the beginning of the pandemic, they felt really hooped. So we started just doing pulpit supply for them. You know, wow. Our whole team, myself, Elita, Jer, Chris, Daryl, just taking turns, and some people we were training. And then this trust began to build and say, hey, could you come meet with our board as we're trying to think what to do? So I started once a month driving out, meeting with their board, with Chris, the other guy on my team. And then this like real sense of like what might happen. They came to the conclusion as a board that they wanted to do revitalization, but they didn't feel like they had it in them to bring in another pastor, a start-stop again, like that. They wanted to partner with an existing church, and they invited us to have that conversation among also some other churches. And they decided, hey, would you guys be up for this? And when you tell these stories and fast forward, like, and so I'll come back, but we ended up merging churches. So wow. This 50-year-old church at this time with maybe 30 members who are mostly over the age of 60. And then our young church plant, who at this time had not met in person before. Wow. Began this discernment journey that took the better part of 6 months and some really difficult conversations about what would that look like to marry, to marry one another. And then we did get married, and we had our first sort of launch service Easter this last year, and it was stunning. And Ross Pilgrim, who's one of the board members, who's been there for decades, he comes up, he's crying. He's like, I haven't seen people on the balcony for 20 years. Wow. We haven't used it in 20 years. Wow. And so we didn't, come with a plan for that per se, but we wanted to ask the question, how might we play our part in revitalization? And a lot of the last 15 years, I think, has been conversation about church planting. We need church planting. Yeah. But we do need to ask the question about revitalization and succession. I think we need to be saying, what does succession look like? Because we're seeing boomers retire, and revitalization of churches. And those are revitalization, planting, and succession are three very different problems to solve. Maybe some principles that can be applied, but it's a very different journey partnering with this church called Sutherland, that's now called The Way, North Vancouver. And to say, what does honor really look like? And you can press into any part of the journey. It's a longer conversation, but like, what does it look like to sign that agreement? What does it look like to acquire an asset that size? What does it look like to think about governance as they disband their model? How do you build trust over time? So lots of little details, but the main thing was honor, and refusing to let ourselves pretend to honor, but to actually love and honor. Because here's the thing, there was moments in the journey where what would have been easier would be to say yes to something. Like, it's kind of a bit like, at times it feels like a bit of a negotiation. Like, okay, what's this going to look like? And I'll give like a silly example. Like, maybe there was real questions about, like, will the music change? And we love, like, we sing hymns and stuff, and even songs from the 90s. Like, give me a 90s Vineyard song, like Refiner's Fire. Like, we're about that. Yeah. But I knew it'd still feel like change for them. And it was tempting for me to be like, we're going to promise to do at least one of him every week and one this. And that would have really helped them, because they're trying to say, we don't know of what we're letting go of. But like, token honor would have been just like saying all those things. But I'm like, no, I really, really love them and really, really care. And so how can we serve them in this transition? So we talked a lot with our like teams about that. But then also knowing that things have to change, or else we can't open up this church. So sometimes you hear people say extreme things like everything's got to change. Well, no, like, we need to honor their story and their past. Yeah. And we need to take them on a change journey. But some things really do need to change, because obviously what was happening before was not achieving the outcomes they'd hoped for. Yeah. And it's been such a beautiful journey. There's been real moments. It was buckets and buckets of work. But the result is, I would say, about, like, I don't want to exaggerate, like maybe 26 of the 30 people are still with us. Awesome. We have like key members of their board leading small group, people in their 60s leading small groups with people in their 20s together, like intergenerational small groups in the city of North Vancouver. It is like, I can't believe what God has done. It is so miraculous, the timing, the moment. And then what we're learning together now is like, how do we do multi-site? Like, that's the journey for us. We're figuring that out, and we have ideas, but I don't think we've got that. But it's an image of revitalization. And I want to be sensitive as I say this, but the end goal is that we give it away. So we inherited a building. We're running fundraisers to see it renovated and become integrated in the community, a great venue for different partnerships with neighbors and schools. And we have a vibrant congregation there now. But the dream is that there would be a pastor with his or her own apostolic vision. Wow. That would inherit it one day. We're not trying to get rid of it. We want to be part of that story, but like, we're stewards of this. And I think multi-site is a tool for revitalization. It's one of many tools for revitalization. But at some point, I'd love to see that be its own church planting church. And so I hope that I'll have the opportunity one day to be part of a team that entrusts that church, that congregation, the resources, hopefully paid off all the debt, with the vibrant church with relationships in the city, to someone that's like, I can plant churches in North Van and West Van from here. And I think a good example of that is obviously different context, but in Texas, Matt Chandler, like they did multi-site for the purpose of revitalization, and now all of them are autonomous again. And I think there's something worth talking about. I think that's over a 12-year timeline. I might have that wrong, but I think there's something there worth exploring.
It's great, Jason. I want to come back just a little bit, just a final question for us today, because there's so many different avenues that we could go down, and you've raised some wonderful questions that I think we could broach at another time. But I want to come back to your particular heart for renewal in Canada. And you've been a part of the Canadian Church Leaders Network, helping to lead that. And for those who haven't listened to their podcast, it's an incredible podcast. And I want to direct any listeners to that podcast. It's been a great source of encouragement to me personally. But I know that you guys have set out to really curate something of an environment where the whole church in Canada might flourish. You kind of talked a lot about values of unity and wanting to see ourselves as lovers of Jesus in 50 years' time, some of those amazing kind of visionary pieces for us as leaders. Now, I wonder if you could speak just a bit more to your involvement with the Canadian Church Leaders podcast and what that means by seeing the tide rise in Canada. And that might not be an overnight thing. That could be 10, 20, 30 years. But what that means is you are seeking to see leaders really championed in Canada, be healthy, and that's going to lead to churches being planted. That's going to lead to renewal in Canada. I just would love to hear some of your approach to that.
Sure. So I'm really convinced that the best shot strategically for a town or a city to experience, or a neighborhood to experience, the kind of transformation that we all long for, followers of Jesus or not, we long for it. I believe the local church is the best mechanism for it, like healthy communities. And one time Daryl said, like, when a city's unhealthy, we as a church blame the city. But he goes, like, shouldn't we be asking, like, where's the church? And what he was getting at, who was doing it from scripture, he was like in the salt and light metaphor, when something rots and decays, you don't go like, what's wrong with this dang fish? Why is it rotting? You go, no one packed it with salt. You know, that preserving agent. When it's dark, you don't go like, oh man, the darkness. You go, where's the light? And obviously, like, maybe there's limits to that metaphor, but it's like the health of a city is connected to the health of a church is the idea there. But the health of a church is connected to the health of the leadership of the church. Yeah. And so we have two issues in Canada, and probably similar in your context. We need more pastors. We have a pipeline issue. And to solve a pipeline issue, you need a broader end of the front end of the funnel. So you need more people becoming, and you need to decrease the attrition rate of 20s, 30s, 40-year-olds quitting or not making it or busting out because of scandal or going after money or these different things. But then you also have to create other on-ramps for people at different stages, different decades of life to find themselves coming from even business or whatever other trade, education into leadership in the church. So there's a pipeline question. We need more leaders. So first, more leaders. The second, we need better leaders.
Yeah, wow.
We need better leaders. Like, I need to be a better pastor. I need to be, especially our generation, we're so shallow, man. Me and you are shallow. We struggle to pause and pray. We struggle to be like honest with one another. We struggle to be honest about, like, we're distracted. We struggle with our formation. So we need really good leaders. And maybe, I don't know if this is true, but it's always been hard to be a pastor, but it's particularly hard in a post-Christian, like, digital world we're living in. So we need better pastors. We need pastors like who in a shallow culture aren't shallow themselves. And so we're asking the question, how do you do that? There's tons of ways to do that. But we're asking the question, how could we contribute to that? And then what kind of leader will thrive in the future? Yeah. And so we began to ask the question, like, how could we affect change where 20-year-old pastors aren't trying to become famous on Instagram?
Yeah.
But why are they wanting to do that? Why do they want to speak at conference? Why do they want to wear certain clothes? It's because we've celebrated that. It's been the model we've shown. Wow. So how do we change culture? We show a different picture. We celebrate faithfulness. We celebrate integrity. We celebrate, let me give you an example. I love Tim Keller. So so Tim Keller championed urban church planting. The conversation has been urban. What's the problem now? No one wants to plant rural. You guys experience that in Australia? That's what we're experiencing here in Canada. Like, no one wants to go do a rural church planting or pastor church in a parish context or a small town context. Like, well, let's change the culture. Let's celebrate stories of how awesome it is when a young man or a young woman, like Tia Morling, she's amazing. She is 29, if I have her age right, and she feels called to be a pastor. She's part of the Pentecostal Assemblies of Newfoundland. She's in a small town of 15 people leading a 90-year-old church with 40 people in it. And that is hardcore.
Wow.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And so we figured if we can tell stories and create content that champions like a deeper spirituality, we think the church of tomorrow still needs to be orthodox in theology.
Yeah.
Needs to be dependent on the Spirit, focused on people far from God, integrated in their view of city renewal or societal renewal, not just, one metric over another. And so we go, how do we affect that? And so we do that through creating content and experiences and gatherings. The other thing we know is people need community to last and be healthy. So we try to create communities and gatherings. And then we have some different programs that go really deep. We do this like one program called the Incubator. It's like 2 years long. There's just 15 of us who lead churches, and we're just doing the work together, trying to become better over time at our craft. And I think we need to change the name. I hate that it's called Church Leaders Network.
Yeah.
Because, oh man, I'm going to get in trouble here. Okay. I take that back. It's a great name. It's fine. We have a lot of really good leadership conversation and content. I don't have anything else to contribute that. There's way better leadership people. The conversation that I think we also need to be having in addition to great leadership, and these are obviously connected and it's a false dichotomy I'm creating, but it serves the point, is how do we become pastors and disciples, men and women of integrity? I want to talk about like our hearts as leaders and who we're becoming, because I think the principle still stands in discipleship like parenting. You get who you are.
Yeah.
And so it's like, I'm so grateful for all the leadership content I've taken in. It's really helps us. Like I take it, I'm not cynical about that. Like I'm all about best practices. And if you've got like a tutorial on planning center, that means that people won't fall through the cracks and you can keep that system tight. I'm all about that. If you've got good plans for marketing of how you can get more people on Alpha so that people are becoming Christians, awesome. I'm all for that. But I don't think that's our main crisis. Our main crisis is like the hearts of leaders. Wow. And so what I mean is like, how do we have a conversation? The conversation we want to have is about like, what does it mean to be a pastor who's like Daryl? Or I just interviewed another guy called Sundar Krishnan. He's at one church for like 34 years, amazing guy at the later end of his like ministry career. And he'll be preaching for a long time longer, just until like he's got no voice left. And just another picture of someone who loved Jesus to the end. And he said this crazy thing. I hope I'll quote it right. He's like, he pastored in one spot, I think, if I have this right, for more than 30 years. And he says, about 15 years in, I realized people weren't listening to my sermons, they're watching my life. Mm-hmm. And I want to learn to become a better preacher, take tips and courses. But I think the main thing that we're trying to do is like stir the embers of what it means to be a leader of integrity who loves Jesus. And then we want to paint a hopeful story for the church in Canada. Like the stats are real, same as Australia. Like there's attrition, there's like decreased engagement, but there's lots of reason to be full of hope. Like God's on the move. Yeah. God is building his church. Like he's churning the soil and there's a new thing he's doing. And so we want to champion the Canadian story. And so we want to learn from global thought leaders, but like share those stories of like, of Sundar or Tia or whoever it is doing amazing things in different contexts, and then realizing we have more in common than we think. And that whole be competitive against other churches, like that day's done. We're in this together. Absolutely. One person wins, we all win. Someone loses, we're all losing. And you asked the first question, what's God doing right now or what's happening? I think one of the things that we're experiencing is people are saying we could do this together, cross denominations, cross traditions. In 2 weeks, we're going away to this like retreat center, 40 pastors with their spouses. Not all of them are married, so some of them don't have spouses coming, but just like we're going away, we're just doing, and it's like Orthodox minister, Catholic minister, non-denominational Baptist, all pastors. And the only thing we have in common is we all had a couple friends in common, and we're just going to go away, and there'll be a little bit of like spiritual refreshment, but it's just time together in the room. And I think that honors God. I think we can learn from each other. And I also think it gives us a perspective of the bigger thing that can give us courage to go after the thing in our particular context and place.
Wow. Jason, I'm so encouraged by our conversation. I wonder if there's just one more thing that you wanted to share with our audience today. Maybe not, but if there was just something that the Lord had laid on your heart to encourage listeners today.
Oh man, that's a hard one more thing. I said so many things. The only thing I'm thinking when you said that is like how much I regret talking so much and rambling and being like, did I finish all my thoughts that I opened up? So I don't know. I'm just honored to be here, man. I think here's the one thing to the guy or girl who is leading a church and it's hard or it's awesome. I'm just so grateful that you're doing it. I mean it. Like, I know I'm a pastor, but I really mean it. Pastors are my heroes. Like it's such good work. Yeah. And it's such an honor. And yeah, keep going. Don't give up. Stand firm. Just think about how much the Apostle Paul was like, stand firm. Don't give up. Endure. And I think we need just to remind each other, like, it's so good what you're doing. Run the marathon, not the sprint. But what an honor we get to do this together. I know it's hard, but what an honor we get to do this together. And I feel in this moment, like really feel it. Like I'm emboldened imagining pastors scattered across Australia, waking up tomorrow to go after loving people in their congregation, having conversations, trying to meet neighbors and write a sermon. I'm strengthened knowing that there's brothers and sisters doing that. So thank you so much. And Charlie, let's do this for 50 more years, man. Let's encourage each other. Yeah. In the Lord, in our work, not take ourselves very seriously, take God super seriously. Yeah. And that's what's on my heart.
You're a great encouragement, Jason. We really appreciate you being with us today.
Thanks for having me, man.
Thanks for listening. For more great resources, please head to our website at exponential.org.au.